There was a particular quietness to that house that only settled in when something terrible was about to happen. It was not the comfortable silence of a fireplace crackling at the end of the day, nor the lazy pause between one cup of tea and the next. It was the kind of silence that precedes the storm. And it was in this silence that Mira Voss understood that her father had sold her. She did not hear the confession from his lips. Mira discovered the truth in the cruelest way possible, through a letter left carelessly upon her father's mahogany desk, folded with negligence between gambling receipts and overdue credit notes. The handwriting belonged to Viscount Aldrich Pemberton, a man whose reputation preceded his presence the way the stench of rotting flesh precedes a corpse. The arrangement was detailed with the coldness of a commercial transaction, Mira's hand in exchange for the forgiveness of a debt that exceeded any sum the Voss family could muster in 2 generations. Mira read the letter 3 times. The first time, her hands trembled. The second time, her vision blurred. The third time, something inside her simply broke, not with the dramatic crash of a vase hurled against a wall, but with the dry, definitive snap of a rotten branch beneath the weight of accumulated snow. She returned the letter to its place and climbed the stairs with the impeccable posture she had been taught since childhood. Because a lady of society does not crumble where others can see her. A lady of society crumbles in private, behind locked doors. Her bedroom was a time capsule of unkept promises. The white muslin dress for her second ball lay untouched upon the chair. Upon the vanity, a bottle of violet perfume, a gift from her mother before she passed, caught the gray November light and returned it in opaque fragments. Mira sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself a brutal clarity. Her father did not love her. Perhaps he never had. She was an asset, a bargaining chip, a promissory note with legs and a practiced smile. And Viscount Pemberton. Good God, Viscount Pemberton. Mira had seen him only twice, once at the theater, where his gray, dead eyes had found her in the audience with the precision of a predator, and once at a reception where he had held her hand for too long, his fingers cold and dry as old paper. He was 57 years of age, had 1 wife buried, 2 known mistresses, and an appetite for young debutantes that society chose to ignore with the same elegance with which it ignored stains on tablecloths during a formal dinner. She chose the darkest dress she owned, a navy blue wool, thick, practical, without adornment. A dress for disappearing. She stuffed into a traveling bag her mother's perfume, a few saved pounds, and a small volume of Byron that had been the only genuine gift her father ever gave her, when he still pretended to care. She did not weep as she closed the bag. Her tears would come later, mingled with the rain. In that moment, she was all purpose, all decision, all the silent ferocity of a woman who refuses to be a lamb led to the slaughter. And she left through the back door at 4 in the afternoon, when the light was already retreating like a guest who senses it is unwelcome. London in November was a city in permanent mourning. The rain, that fine, persistent rain that had not the decency to be a declared storm, seeped through every seam until it reached the bones. Mira kept to the secondary streets, skirting puddles that reflected a sky without hope, until the shops fell behind and mansions rose like monuments to privilege. She had no plan, but she had a name. Gideon Hartwell, the Duke of Crestmore. The man society called cold as marble. They said his wife had died of loneliness before the fever had the chance to take her. That he lived as a ghost among bookshelves and bottles of brandy, and that no one crossed his gates without being returned with a courtesy so glacial it amounted to a slap. Mira knew all of this. And still, Her feet carried her there with the determination of someone who has nothing left to lose. The rain intensified. Her wool dress, soaked through, weighed like lead. Her lady's shoes had abandoned any pretense of utility. And still she walked, because to stop meant to think, and to think meant to collapse. Hartwell House appeared in the dusk like an apparition. Wrought iron gates, an avenue of bare oaks with branches interlaced like fingers in prayer, and the house itself, massive limestone, something between palace and mausoleum. Light burned in only one window. A single window on the second floor, like a solitary eye watching the storm. Mira pushed the gate. It yielded with a groan of metal that sounded exactly as she felt, rusted, reluctant, forced to move. When she reached the dark oak door, she was trembling so violently she could barely raise her hand. She knocked 3 times. The sound was swallowed by the rain. She knocked again. And again. When the door finally opened, it was not the butler who appeared. It was the Duke himself, holding a candlestick whose flame wavered in the cold air. And Mira, soaked to the soul, looked up and found not the monolith of ice society described, but a man whose eyes carried the same look she saw in her own reflection, the look of someone who has forgotten what it is like not to be tired. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing only a white shirt with rolled sleeves, no waistcoat, no coat, no cravat, with the hands of a pianist, long and ink-stained. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, visible only when the candlelight found it at the right angle, like a secret the skin kept reluctantly. His eyes were a green so dark it nearly passed for black. He did not ask who she was. He simply stepped aside, in a gesture that was not quite an invitation but neither a rejection, the gesture of someone who recognizes something in another without needing introductions. The door closed, and the world divided in two, outside, the rain and everything it represented. Inside, the scent of candle wax, old paper, and sandalwood. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing only a white shirt with rolled sleeves, no waistcoat, no coat, no cravat, with the hands of a pianist, long and ink-stained. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, visible only when the candlelight found it at the right angle, like a secret the skin kept reluctantly. His eyes were a green so dark it nearly passed for black. He did not ask who she was. He simply stepped aside, in a gesture that was not quite an invitation but neither a rejection, the gesture of someone who recognizes something in another without needing introductions. The door closed, and the world divided in two, outside, the rain and everything it represented. Inside, the scent of candle wax, old paper, and sandalwood. When the flames gathered strength and the room filled with golden light, he said, in the deep voice of one who seldom used it, that she should sit near the fire. He asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply offered the armchair and went to pour brandy as one offers water. Mira sat. The armchair received her as if it knew her, and that familiarity nearly made her weep, because nobody and nothing received her thus, as though she belonged. The warmth thawed her extremities, and with it came the pain. All at once. Gideon did not move, did not approach, did not offer empty words. He simply stood by the bookshelf, holding his glass, and allowed her to come apart. And in that act of simply doing nothing, there was more compassion than in all the words of comfort Mira had heard in her entire life. When the sobs receded like the tide, he murmured that she need not explain anything. That explanations could wait until she was dry, warm, and fed, because no one should narrate their destruction while still trembling. Mira felt something take root between her lungs, fragile and reluctant, like a seed sprouting in winter without knowing if spring will come. Act 4, Days of Sandalwood and Silence. The days that followed unfolded with the precious slowness of pages turned in an old book. Mira remained at Hartwell House not by formal invitation. Gideon never issued one, but by the deliberate absence of any request that she leave. She slept in a second-floor room where the sheets smelled of forgotten lavender and the curtains filtered November light in shades of honey and gray. Each morning she found tea and toast at her door, left by invisible hands, like offerings at a temple whose deity no one dared face directly. They developed, without prior arrangement, a domestic choreography of rare delicacy. Mira spent her mornings in the library, exploring the shelves like an unknown continent, discovering Gideon's annotations in the margins, thoughts in small, slanting script that revealed a man very different from the walking mausoleum society described. He wrote as though arguing with dead philosophers, debating poets on the nature of loss, as though books were his only interlocutors and he refused to be a passive listener. Gideon spent his afternoons in the adjoining study, and through the half-open door Mira heard the scratch of his pen on paper. Sometimes, in the silence between his paragraphs, she felt his gaze. Not the appraising gaze of ballrooms that catalogued her like an auction piece, but something different, cautious and hungry at once, like someone approaching a hearth after years in the cold, afraid of being burned. It was on the fourth night that he told her about Eleanor. Not because Mira asked, but because the silence between them had grown so comfortable that words found room to exist without hurry. He said his wife had died not of loneliness, as gossip alleged, but of puerperal fever, taking with her the child she carried. He said the world was not wrong to call him empty. He was empty, the way a house is empty after a fire, walls still standing, but nothing inside to justify calling it home. Mira listened in silence, and when he finished, she did not offer rehearsed condolences. Instead, she told him about her mother, how she used to sing whilst brushing Myra's hair, how her violet perfume was the last thing Mira sensed before sleep, and how, after she was gone, the whole world smelled of nothing. She told him about the father who became a stranger, the letter on the desk, the Viscount whose predator eyes found her at the theater. That night, for the first time, they conversed not merely with silence but with imperfect, halting words that stumbled over one another like travelers on a dark path. And when they finally fell quiet, the embers in the hearth had become ash, and something between them had become something else. In the days that followed, Mira began to notice the small ways Gideon cared for her without ever drawing attention to the fact. An extra shawl appeared on the armchair when the night grew cold. The Byron she had brought materialized upon a shelf at her eye level, beside other books he seemed to have selected with the care of a gardener choosing seeds for a garden he wished to see bloom. And every afternoon at precisely 5 o'clock, a tea tray appeared in the library bearing 2 cups instead of 1, as though the entire house had decided she belonged there before either of them had the courage to say so. Society, as was its custom, did not take long to discover. News in London traveled faster than carriages and with far less discretion. Within a week, the drawing room seethed with the story. The Voss girl, the barren and discarded debutante, had fled to the soulless Duke's mansion. The versions multiplied like weeds. They said she had thrown herself at his feet like a desperate courtesan. They said he kept her as prisoner, or trophy, or distraction for his pathological grief. Her father's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a servant who had cycled to Hartwell House in rain that seemed never to have stopped since the night she fled. The tone was one of calculated indignation. He demanded her immediate return, reminded her of her filial duties, and mentioned, almost as a footnote, that Viscount Pemberton was growing impatient and the family could not afford to disappoint him. Mira read the letter in the library and felt something different this time. Not the cold pain of discovery, nor the hot despair of flight. She felt anger. A clean, structural anger, like forged steel, that sustained her instead of consuming her. She did not reply. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and used it as a bookmark in the Byron she had brought, a small act of rebellion that gave her more satisfaction than any written response could. The Viscount came in person on a Thursday. Mira heard his carriage before she saw it, horses and wheels on the stone avenue, followed by knocking that sounded like a rite being exercised, not a request for entry. Gideon descended the stairs before she could move, and something in his bearing had changed. His shoulders, which normally carried grief like an invisible cloak, were squared. His eyes, usually veiled with exhaustion, shone with something cutting. Mira did not see the conversation. She stood at the top of the staircase, hands gripping the mahogany banister, but she heard fragments rising like smoke, the Viscount's voice, oily and possessive, insisting Mira belonged to him by contract. And Gideon's voice, which she barely recognized, because it was a voice that neither asked permission nor offered apology. He told the Viscount that no woman was a clause in a contract. That Voss's debt was Voss's problem, and that if the Viscount wished to pursue the matter legally, he was welcome to do so, but that so long as Mira wished to remain under that roof, remain she would, and neither the Viscount, nor her father, nor all of damned London society would decide for her. The door closed with a force that rattled the windows. Gideon climbed the stairs and found Mira at the top, pale and trembling, not from cold this time, but from something she could not name. He stopped 2 steps below her, and for a moment their eyes were level, dark green against golden brown, and the space between them seemed to hold a question neither knew how to ask. Mira opened her mouth, but found there were no words adequate for what she felt. So she did the only thing that seemed right. She raised her hand to his face and touched the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, that secret the skin kept reluctantly. Gideon closed his eyes at the contact, and something in his expression came undone, not broke, as things that shatter, but came undone, as knots that finally yield when someone finds the right end to pull. When he opened his eyes again, they were clearer than Mira had ever seen them, as though a layer of ice had melted, revealing the true green beneath. The confession did not come as it does in the novels Mira read. There was no grand declaration, no theatrical gesture, no providential rain creating the perfect atmosphere. It came on an ordinary evening, 2 weeks after the Viscount's visit, when they had already formed the habit of reading together in the library after supper. Mira occupied the left armchair, which she already considered hers, and Gideon the right, and between them burned a fire that had long since stopped apologizing for its warmth. She was reading aloud, something that had begun by accident, when Gideon had fallen asleep in his chair and she, instead of retiring, continued reading to herself in a murmur that had, without her noticing, become audible. He had woken without her knowledge and lain listening, and since then she read to him every evening, and he never mentioned that he was not sleeping, and she never mentioned that she knew he was not. That night, Mira read a passage about birds that migrated in winter, creatures that flew thousands of miles with no guarantee of finding somewhere to land, driven only by something stronger than fear. She broke off mid-sentence because she felt his gaze, and when she lifted her face, she found something in his expression that made her forget how to breathe. She was reading aloud, something that had begun by accident, when Gideon had fallen asleep in his chair and she, instead of retiring, continued reading to herself in a murmur that had, without her noticing, become audible. He had woken without her knowledge and lain listening, and since then she read to him every evening, and he never mentioned that he was not sleeping, and she never mentioned that she knew he was not. That night, Mira read a passage about birds that migrated in winter, creatures that flew thousands of miles with no guarantee of finding somewhere to land, driven only by something stronger than fear. She broke off mid-sentence because she felt his gaze, and when she lifted her face, she found something in his expression that made her forget how to breathe. Gideon said then, in the voice she had learned to decipher as one learns a foreign tongue, every hesitation a meaning, every pause an unspoken word, that he had spent 3 years convinced the world was a place where beautiful things existed only to be lost. He said that when she had knocked at his door that November night, he had opened it expecting to find yet another person wanting something from him, his title, his fortune, his influence. But instead he had found someone who wanted nothing of him save a roof, and that absence of expectation had been the most extraordinary thing anyone had offered him since Eleanor's death. Mira opened her mouth to reply, but he raised his hand, not to silence her, but to ask for a moment, like someone gathering courage to leap from a cliff. He said he knew what the world said about her. Barren. Discarded. Ruined. And that the world was as wrong about her as it was about him. He said she was none of those things, just as he was not empty. They were simply people the world had broken and then blamed for being broken. Then he spoke the words Mira would carry with her for the rest of her life, the way one carries a lit candle through a dark corridor. He said that if she would allow it, and only if she would allow it, because he refused to be yet another man making decisions for her, he would like her to stay. Not as a guest, not as a ward, not as an object of charity from a reclusive duke, but as someone he chose. His first choice. His only choice. The person for whom he was willing to feel again, even knowing that to feel meant risking loss. Mira listened, and for the first time in her life, the words directed at her came without conditions, contracts, or expectations. There was no debt to be settled, no appearance to be maintained, no commercial transaction disguised as affection. There was only a broken man offering his pieces to a broken woman, hoping that perhaps, their fragments might form something whole. She did not reply with words. She reached across the space between the armchairs, that space which for weeks had been an impassable ocean, and found his hand. Pianist's hand, ink-stained, warm now. He laced his fingers through hers with a gentleness that contrasted with everything he was, the duke, the recluse, the man the world called a rogue, and Mira felt, at the precise point where his skin met hers, the exact moment her former life ended and a new one began. Then he spoke the words Mira would carry with her for the rest of her life, the way one carries a lit candle through a dark corridor. He said that if she would allow it, and only if she would allow it, because he refused to be yet another man making decisions for her, he would like her to stay. Not as a guest, not as a ward, not as an object of charity from a reclusive duke, but as someone he chose. His first choice. His only choice. The person for whom he was willing to feel again, even knowing that to feel meant risking loss. Mira listened, and for the first time in her life, the words directed at her came without conditions, contracts, or expectations. There was no debt to be settled, no appearance to be maintained, no commercial transaction disguised as affection. There was only a broken man offering his pieces to a broken woman, hoping that perhaps, their fragments might form something whole. She did not reply with words. She reached across the space between the armchairs, that space which for weeks had been an impassable ocean, and found his hand. Pianist's hand, ink-stained, warm now. He laced his fingers through hers with a gentleness that contrasted with everything he was: the Duke, the recluse, the man the world called a rogue, and Mira felt, at the precise point where his skin met hers, the exact moment her former life ended and a new one began. They stayed that way for a long time, hands clasped between the armchairs, while the fire crackled and the November rain, which seemed never to have ceased, as though all of London were being baptized anew, beat against the library windows. The clock in the vestibule marked the seconds, but time within those walls obeyed other laws, laws that had to do with the rhythm of two hearts learning, cautiously and wonderingly, to beat together. Mira Voss, the ruined debutante, the girl whose father had sold her to pay his gambling debts, the woman society had discarded before ever giving her a chance, Mira smiled. And Gideon Hartwell, the Duke of Crestmore, the widower, the ghost whom society had abandoned as thoroughly as he had abandoned society, Gideon smiled back. And in those two imperfect, trembling smiles there was more truth than in all the drawing rooms of London and all the promises ever made across mahogany desks. Outside, the rain continued to fall as though it wished to wash the world clean of all its sins. It would not succeed, of course. It never does. But that night, inside that library full of books and finally full of something more, two people the world had discarded found in each other the rarest and simplest thing there is, the unshakable certainty of being, for the first time, someone's first choice. And that was everything. And that was enough.